Welcome everybody to our next salon. I'm very happy to introduce Andrew Young, who is a PhD candidate in the Centre for Comparative Literature at the University of Toronto. His dissertation is a study of Haitian writings, literary and political, from 1797 to 1859, with a focus on political philosophy and sovereignty, so right in the heart of early Caribbean studies. Today, he's going to offer some thoughts on slavery as systematized crime, reading Baron de Vasti and Equiano together.
Thank you very much. Let's see if here I can share my screen. All right. Yeah, so thank you for that generous introduction. As you mentioned, this is coming from the third chapter of my dissertation. And this is kind of a speculative encounter, an argument for reading Equiano and Haitian literature together, because even without direct proof of a strong influence, these thinkers can be kind of mutually illuminating. So I'm talking today about the Baron de Vati. Vati was principal secretary to King Henri Christophe and wrote several volumes between 1814 and 1820. Now, unfortunately, there's no direct evidence that Vati read Equiano, especially since he did not read or speak much English. But Vati was on very good terms with various international abolitionists. He corresponded with the British abolitionists, and he drew heavily from the works of the Abbé Grégoire, citing from Grégoire's most famous work, Often, which translates roughly to On the Literature of the Negroes. In that volume, let's see if I can, there we go. In that volume, there's a section on Equiano of about a half a dozen pages. You can see here his name he's listed as Vassa, in which Grégoire writes that Equiano's authorship was attested to in his autobiography because otherwise it would have been denied. So we all know this, this is endorsed by a section at the beginning of the volume. Grégoire explains, this precaution is useful against a class of individuals always disposed to calumniate the Negroes, to attenuate the crimes of their oppressors. Now, Vati, we see this at the bottom here, will later write in a much more general, kind of almost aphoristic way, that it is the custom of butchers to calumniate their victims. Now, key in both quotations here is calumniate. It comes from calumny. And while I've not found either word in Equiano, both words will reoccur regularly in many Haitian texts. Vati uses them both regularly. Calumny means insult or slander. They can also mean falsely laying a criminal charge. So as anyone familiar with abolitionist rhetoric and activism would know, early abolitionism tend to focus on the slave trade rather than slavery in general, often arguing that enslaved people were captured and sold unjustly. One early abolitionist goal was to have the slave trade understood as a crime, first tainted by regular criminal acts like kidnap or smuggling, and then as a crime in general. And you see that the slave trade does become criminalized in the early 19th century. Now, since Equiano's story begins as a kidnap narrative, Grégoire's comments about attenuating crime is particularly important here. Grégoire attributes to Equiano the foresight to know that enslavers will attempt to minimize or even reverse any crimes imputed to them by calumniating their victims. Vati then generalizes this lesson into a principle for interpreting all pro-slavery rhetoric. So this is just sort of one example of where I've seen the direct or indirect influence, or somewhat direct. Indirectly, however, where the text isn't passing from one to the other, the questions of crimes and collective resistance link both authors, I think, pretty strongly. So in her essay on Equiano and Paradise Lost, Mary Nyquist explores the meaning of Equiano's citations of Milton, and this is the one that she focused on, by putting his writings into conversation with the dominant interpretive modes of his time. So this is the question of Satanism. Is Satan the hero of Paradise Lost or not? And so people have argued over what it means that Equiano is sort of sympathetic to the devil's cause here. Is he this kind of English radical? So by way of background, Nyquist argues that the influence of Rousseau's social contract on the European radicalism of Equiano's time meant that what she calls the war slavery doctrine, this is the right of the victor or the supposed right of the victor in war to enslave the defeated combatants, now collectively as a nation, had fallen out of favor as a way of justifying transatlantic slavery. She explains, quote, concerning the nature of warfare from which the right to enslave ostensibly derives, Rousseau formulates a novel proposition. War, he states, exists only between states or related non-human entities, not between living human beings. It's not individual. It doesn't affect the individual. We can't collectively enslave the defeated nation. In a move that has Equiano building on Rousseau, Nyquist shows that while English Jacobins, like William Godwin, expressed sympathy for an individual desire for revenge against a tyrant, expressed in this case by Milton Satan, Equiano instead emphasizes quotations from Paradise Lost, like this one, that represented collective resistance to collective enslavement. Right? So, yeah. She states that in getting, the speech here is pronounced by Beelzebub. In getting Beelzebub to protest war slavery doctrine from the standpoint of the enslaved as a new world collectivity, Equiano shifts attention away from individualized conflict between slave and master, conflict that tends to be reinscribed as private as opposed to political where crime happens, as well as from the tyranny of an outmoded god, and trains it for a brief revolutionary moment on fellow Africans refusing to remain rightless in an insufferable hell. Now, again, Gregoire's writings on Equiano are devoted mostly to his biography and not his innovative approach to literary resistance. But that said, Haitians adopt an approach very much in conversation with Equiano's, no matter how indirect the influence, and likewise emphasize the collective character of their resistance against the systematic criminality of enslavers. Now, Nyquist's focus on this Equiano citation, this Milton citation comes at the end of Equiano's chapter 5 in his first volume. Unfortunately, I have not found a similar use of Milton in Haitian thought. Haitians tend to cite Milton without sympathizing with Satan. Vathey, for example, calls a former enslaver the, quote, Beelzebub colonist. That said, the quotations on which Nyquist focus, this one comes in the middle of a long paragraph, and here we are, and that paragraph begins, I'm not going to read the whole thing, by explaining how each colony is alike and how each enslaver is alike. The reality of the enslaver and enslaved relationship corrupts the enslaver as much as it debases the enslaved. So we get the pairing quote here. I've bolded some of the important words that we're going to discuss with Vathey. Equiano is specific in stating that these men are not bad in themselves, not born evil, but it is specifically the material reality of their, quote, pursuits, meaning a profession or class. So this is a material argument, materialist argument about slavery as a system. Right? And so a couple of things here that are coming, they're not born evil, they're hardened by their avarice and their pride, their pursuits, and the pairing of the raising up and the lowering down. So to put this into conversation with Vathey, he's most famous for his early work. This is his first major work, The Colonial System Unveiled, which is his first attempt to denounce slavery as a system. In his more mature work, coming a couple of years later, he has a quite abbreviated career, Vathey explains of enslavers that their prejudices are so strong and deeply rooted in hearts hardened and blinded by passion that we can neither vanquish nor overcome. Right? So hearts hardened, and then we've got this longer quote here. Their pride sets them apart from humanity, and that it's instantiated by the force of habit. Right? So for Vathey, the ex-colonists are so corrupted by their despotic temperament that they can no longer understood anyone. So speak to them in a different language. If you don't speak the language of self-interest, they will not hear you. He says they cannot understand anyone who does not act and think like they do. He sets this class of men apart from the rest of the human race, or rather shows how they have set themselves apart and that any attempt to reason with them are useless. The ex-colonists cannot empathize and thus cannot reason justly. They only understand self-interest. And again, this is by habit, by the material relations of the slave relation, in the same way that Equiano suggests that it is the habit or the pursuit of enslavement that creates the slave owner's temperament. So as a very brief conclusion, I'm going to cite French historian Nellie Schmidt from her study of abolitionism over 5 centuries, in which she laments that abolitionist arguments often needed to, quote, employ Manichean arguments about good and evil at the expense of the economic reasoning to which they remain strangers. The economic arguments of the delegates of the planters and the ship owners appeared indisputable to them. This is kind of a white abolitionist. So they argued on other grounds, much less effectively. Equiano and Vate certainly do not avoid moral arguments, but in reading them together, we can also think about how they make systematic arguments based on material conditions to strengthen those moral arguments. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you so much, Andrew, for that really, really important cross-reading. And one thing that's occurring to me as you're talking is thinking of Equiano, Vate, Cugoano actually really occurred to me as you were talking about this systemic argument. And I'm thinking of how critical race studies and critical race theory are falling out of favor in the United States precisely because they're being attacked for kind of revealing the systematic aspect of the afterlives of slavery, of the necropolitical US, indeed Canadian system. So I just wonder if you've any thoughts on that sort of idea of Black radicalism,
Yeah, I think
going back.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that question a great deal. I mean, so the foremost scholar on the Baron de Vate's work is Marlena Doubt. So she wrote a monograph on Vate, Baron de Vate, and the origins of Black radicalism. I might be mistaking the title, but in it she suggests specifically that what Vate is doing is a kind of critical race theory avant la lettre. And there are other Haitian thinkers who are engaging in a similar kind of practice. And so Vate is quite fascinating in that way because one of the premises of critical race theory is that law creates race. And, or this, like you said, this kind of systematic creation of race. And the fascinating thing about the texts that I study, I focus on them specifically because they're what I like to call recognition literature. So it's all texts that are trying to get recognition for Haitian sovereignty. So whether this is Toussaint Louverture trying to get himself recognized as the legitimate head of the colony, or someone like Vate arguing that Christophe's regime should be recognized, they're making this argument, we have fulfilled the requirements of sovereignty and therefore we should be recognized. The fascinating problem there is that if law makes race, what is the law that's operating internationally that's racializing Haiti? And so Vate actually has a fascinating kind of argument about sort of international law. He talks about public opinion that he's trying to convince. So public opinion, this queen that rules the world and calls all kings, to her feet or something like this. So I think the sort of roundabout answer to your question is that trying to understand the system that's kind of trapping Haiti in this non-sovereign, non-recognition place that it struggles with throughout its history. I mean, you can say to this day that Haiti's sovereignty has never been fully recognized. What is it that's doing that? How is it doing it? How is the world community doing that? I think is a very big part of Vate's work. So I appreciate the question.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think this, the what a lot of them get at, and what Equiano certainly gets at, is what blackness comes to mean globally. As you say, the sort of, if we go back to Elsa Gouveia and we go back to Jennifer Nash's work on Partus Sequitur Ventrum, we can see, yes, we can see the laws made race, but also the laws were there to start putting into the container that was needed racialized systems that were already sort of floating around, and then that becomes sort of I think Sylvia Winter's work is helpful for thinking of how these terms become naturalized, as if they're natural law, biological race, ontology, racialized ontologies become just as if by magic naturalized. So that's really helpful to think of how these texts, Vate and Equiano, kind of seem to know this this process is already in play.
Yeah, and I mean that to me is one of the more fascinating aspects of this work, right? Haitians are receiving Equiano through the Abbe Gregoire, and so Gregoire is himself an abbé, and he's emphasizing sort of the Christian when he writes on Equiano, he's writing about Equiano's Christianity. And what's fascinating about this you mentioned Sylvia Winter's work. Um, One of the things that she talks about is how secularization, so the undermining of Christianity as a master code of legitimation, allows for the growth of race.
Right.
And you can see in abolitionist work, or at least Black abolitionist work, I think the white abolitionists tend to be pretty unconflicted about their faith. I am a Christian. I am saying Christianity requires us to do X. So why aren't you guys doing it? And this is what a lot of white abolitionist work reads as. Whereas with Black abolitionist work, they're emphasizing their Christianity, but not in a way where they know it'll be determinative,
Right.
right? And that to me is extremely fascinating. It's the kind of the necessity of Christianity, because it's still legitimating in some capacity, right? There's still in a background of, well, we have to civilize the non-Christian, the heathens, convert the heathens. But these Black abolitionists, these Black radicals know that it's only going to get them so far.
Right.
And I think this is, I mean, this is a lesson that Tay would have picked up in Gregoire, reading through the whole thing, but including reading the Equiano section, which again emphasizes Equiano's Christianity, Christian brotherhood, his love for his suffering African brothers, and this kind of thing. Yeah, so it's a
Yes.
kind of an ambivalent inheritance.
Yeah, because the irony of the Bunyan plot for Equiano is that even when he has his manumission paper, he knows he's still at risk of being re-enslaved, really anytime he goes on a ship, because
Yeah,
because of his skin, because of what Fanon calls the epidermalization of race at that point. So you're absolutely right. Whereas if we look back to the moment in Robinson Crusoe, I was thinking of when Daniel Defoe or Robinson Crusoe escapes Ottoman slavery with the help
yeah,
of Zuri, a Muslim boy who is dark skinned. And the basis on which he can sell Zuri's freedom to the Portuguese captain is that he will convert to be a Christian and then he will be free. But that's at the beginning of the 18th century. I think you're absolutely right. By the end of the 18th century, that path to freedom via Christianity is gone.
yeah, yeah, and yeah. Actually, um, Gregoire compares Equiano's writing to Defoe's. It has the kind of rustic rudeness of
Yeah.
Defoe, is the way that he puts it. It's like Robinson Crusoe.
Interesting. And I mean, I have no doubt in my own mind that Equiano, that's one of the multiple texts that are in play there, which raises all kinds of questions about the Satan figure as well, of the fall or not fallen. Well, thank you so much. I think this is a wonderful conversation. I've got Black Marxism sitting beside me on my desk as we go through, so we can just, yeah.
Well, that's why I wanted to emphasize the materialist aspect of it, because this is, I mean, this is kind of the background of this discussion, is the Marxists telling, the people working on critical race theory or the like, that they're not materialist enough. And it's, well, this is a very materialist argument, right? These are embodied practices based on economic relationships. Um, and in fact, just just to sort of tease future work, the line about speak to them in a different language, that's there is a line like that in Adam Smith, which Marx may be riffing on, But Marx says something very similar. You know, if you speak to a capitalist in the language of humanity, he'll laugh and think that you're mocking him, right? So
Right.
this idea of, you know, the habit that makes you unable to comprehend one another, it's in Adam Smith, it's in Rousseau, it's in Marx, but it's also present here in people like Equiano and Vate, and they're having an economic conversation as much as any of these other political economists.
Absolutely. And I mean, I think one of the ironies that you're touching on too is that as the time goes on, it's very clear, I'm sure to Equiano and others, that the abolitionists themselves are still white supremacists.
Yeah,
Like this is the problem. That
yeah,
that abolition of the system, even if they're talking in systemic terms, is being taken over by this other system that will become eugenicized biological race, to justify the scramble for Africa. So they actually can, they know full well that the white people they've had to appeal to and work with, like that quotation, you cannot change their minds. Well, I mean, soon the thing will become true of Rousseau and the Wordsworth and the Romanticists, all of those people who simply will not be in a world frame that they will puncture to see um, Black people, brown people, African people as Indigenous people as their actual equal.
yeah. And just to elaborate on that, Deborah Jensen's early work from about a decade ago, some of this rethinking the slave narrative, I forget the exact name of it, is Jensen's work is some of the early stuff to suggest we should be thinking about Haitian work as either abolitionist work or slave narratives in conversation with some of the British abolitionist work and slave narratives. But in both cases, we see that they're being conditioned by either the material conditions of the production. So Equiano obviously doesn't own the printing press; he has to have sponsors, etc. But even in a place like Haiti, where they do have their own printing presses, they're conditioned by the sort of the needs of the needs that they have to communicate, and also the language in which they can be understood. Right? They're communicating. They're trying to get Europeans to understand them. It's very fascinating.
Right. There's so much there. Absolutely. And what's hidden behind all of that indigeneity, other languages, other cultural experiences. Well, thank you so much again for joining us. And
It's a real pleasure. Thank you.
okay, thank you.